Okay, and so today, like I said, we'll talk about crash and roadway data, and we'll talk about two different, basically federally developed criteria that serve as best practices for the collection of both crash data, and we refer to that as MMUCC or MUC, and that stands for Model Minimum Uniform Crash Criteria. It's quite a mouthful. And then on the roadway side, MIRE, or the Model Inventory of Roadway Elements. And so that talks about the data that's most important for trying to develop robust analytical frameworks that can be used to diagnose safety issues and for predictive and forecasting purposes and evaluation and so forth. We'll talk a little bit about some of the Michigan specific data that's been developed by MDOT and some other agencies. And then at various points, we'll talk a little bit about data integration as well. Like I said, assignment 2 was just posted, and I also, a course project, I don't know if that's the right term or not, but I've got some further details about what I'm going to be looking for some assistance in from that perspective over the remainder of the semester as well. And so, oh, and this is driving me crazy. I don't know why. So I've been cobbling together different slide sets, and so sometimes the numbers are red and sometimes they're super large, and it just drives me a little bit insane because I'm kind of obsessive compulsive. But I digress. I won't stop the presentation, and I'll try to edit this out if I remember. But and I didn't make a mistake yesterday in the 849 video. I stated everything correctly, so haha. But it's been a challenge trying to get effective engagement and interaction in that class particularly. I don't know if you guys have any suggestions, because it's completely off topic of this course, but I guess I don't know. Like, one option is to have everybody turn their cameras on. I've tried to give, when I give questions, I try to make them really easy and set them up, kind of tee them up for people, but for whatever reason, and I don't know if it's just reluctancy and people don't have confidence in their stat abilities, but from your perspectives, any thoughts on that? I know, Jordan, I pick on you a few times. I don't know why specifically instead of
Yeah,
Travis, but
I think I feel like it's kind of said just that people are a little not confident in how they interpret statistics. So I feel like it's just kind of fear of saying the completely wrong thing.
yeah.
Yeah.
So that's what I figured. But so, like, in that class, I think I have 75 minutes of content or whatever, and it ends up being like half of that sometimes if I don't have any interaction. So anyway, I'll have sorry, I'm being loud. The door is being closed on me, I think. My second grader is down the hall there. So anyway, so yeah, I'm trying to figure that out. This one's a bit easier because I think this is more conversational and less, I don't know if non-intuitive is the right word, but anyway, hopefully I added all this stuff out as well, but just wanted a little feedback on that. So anyway, so like I said, today we're largely going to talk about data, and specifically about how data are used within the context of transportation safety. And so there's a wide range of different uses, and we've talked in several of the preceding lectures about safety plans. And so this has become a really big issue recently, is just setting targets and performance or data-driven safety initiatives. And so it's been a bit of a change even from back when I was in school back in the late 90s, early 2000s, when states were developing plans, but there wasn't any explicit requirement that they develop goals or objectives that they can measure progress towards. So it was more or less, I'm reluctant to say it was bean counting at that point, but they would track some data, but there wouldn't be any kind of evaluation or revisiting progress with respect to those data ultimately. So that's been a fairly big change that has continued moving forward. And then from just the general traffic engineering safety perspective, investment decisions, states have an increasingly limited amount of funding in which to make these decisions and where to invest projects for safety improvements. And so as a consequence of that, data is really important to make the most informed decisions there. And as a part of that, there's various types of analyses, and I'm assuming you've seen at least some form of these in some prior classes, but sort of at the top level, one of our concerns is just network screening. So trying to basically assess how our roadways are performing. And typically we'll look at different types of locations separately as a part of this process. So intersections versus road segments versus interchanges. And so we want to screen those locations to try to identify where there are either a higher number of crashes than we would expect, or crashes tend to be severe, or whatever metric we're using. And then trying to determine from that list, where there are potential opportunities for safety improvements that could address or correct some of those crash patterns that we're observing ultimately. Once we've identified a set of locations that are appearing to provide higher risk, we can prioritize among that list, and we'll talk about several different ways we can try to prioritize which locations are better candidates for specific types of investments. But that's a second point where data becomes important. And then also in countermeasure selection. And so we'll start talking about that a little bit later. But as an example, your first homework assignment, we'll circle back to some of that next week, where you identified a couple of high risk locations and developed a few countermeasures. And we'll talk about systemic approaches for trying to do that. And again, a lot of that is largely data driven based on prior research that's demonstrated scenarios where specific types of safety improvements tend to be more or less effective. And so we're using the results of those studies to help agencies make more informed decisions in terms of which projects are best for specific types of patterns of crash risks. Okay. And then lastly, data is critically important for evaluation. So kind of building on the preceding point. And this is something that I think we talked about this a few weeks ago in the Highway Safety Improvement Program. States are actually required to evaluate how effective their use of those HSIP funds are. And the way that's typically done is a 3-year evaluation of 3 years of before intervention and 3 years of after intervention data. Is probably the way that's most typically done from different DOTs. And so that's another point where the FHWA is trying to encourage road agencies to be more programmatic and kind of circle back to make sure they're making the best use of those funds. And the way that they do that typically is, they're reporting how much it costs to implement these projects. They can measure what the impacts are on crashes and injuries and fatalities. We can talk a little bit about how we apply economic numbers to those crash reductions, and that's what they would use as a basis for evaluation and future investment decisions. So that's some kind of 50,000 foot perspective type stuff. And then, like I said, related to that, cost benefit analysis is generally a part of that evaluation as well. Okay. And so from that end, there are several different data that are necessary in order for us to make the most informed decisions possible. And so basically 3 general types of crash data. We talked a bit about that on last week's lecture. We'll talk a little bit more about it today. Roadway data, and there we're talking largely about geometric characteristics, so roadway alignment, cross-sectional information, and then traffic data as well. And that could include traffic volumes, speeds, other truck volumes, things of that nature. And a lot of the guidance in this is detailed in this research results digest that was developed as a part of the NCHRP. And this basically was developed in support of the Highway Safety Manual. And so we'll continue talking about the HSM in greater detail. But basically, there are a bunch of methods and empirical models that are presented in the HSM. And the intent is for that document to serve like the Highway Capacity Manual, where agencies would be able to generally apply these methods, provided they have the requisite amount of underlying roadway crash and traffic data. And that's largely what's kind of helped to inform some of the minimum data criteria that I'll talk about in a few minutes from both a crash and a roadway perspective. But for a lot of the methods you'll see in the HSM, some of them get very rigorous and very data intensive. And so some agencies struggle because they simply don't have data in a format where they can easily apply those HSM methods. And so that kind of hinders the whole intent of that document. We'll talk a little bit more about how even from chapter to chapter in the HSM, you will have different levels of data requirements because there hasn't been an explicit integration in the methods across different facility types. So as we talk about how we forecast safety performance for different facilities, in some cases we use methods that aren't quite apples to apples for other facility types. And so there's quite a bit of nuance there. Hopefully we see a little bit more consistency on some of those items moving forward, but that's kind of where we are at present. So from a safety standpoint, so we talked last week, Michigan has, among the better crash data systems in the country. And so at the national level, there were actually standards developed by ANSI, so the American National Standards Institute. So there was a 2007 manual on classification of motor vehicle traffic accidents, and there's an accompanying standard that talks about specific elements that are appropriate for traffic records systems. And so when we look at these efforts, these were developed collaboratively among several federal agencies. So the FHWA and NHTSA. And so FHWA largely, they have a focus on the infrastructure related projects. NHTSA is more focused on the underlying data side, and that would, when I talk about that, it's largely talking about crash data. FHWA would be more infrastructure data, reporting things like VMT, roadway inventory information. FMCSA comes into play because we've talked a little bit about how trucks have more stringent safety requirements. And so they also, if you recall, when we talked about the crash report, there was a whole bunch of information specific to trucks that I kind of went through really quickly, in part because it gets really kind of nuanced. And it's, for our purposes, we're typically not analyzing truck data at that level of detail, but FMCSA is particularly interested in being able to compare safety performance across different truck classifications for various reasons. And then lastly, the Governor's Highway Safety Association. And so each state generally has some type of association or commission. And here in Michigan, it's GITSAC, which is the Governor's Traffic Safety Advisory Commission. And so that's basically a collaboration of all those different safety stakeholders. So engineers, enforcement, education, EMS, et cetera, the 4 E's of traffic safety we talked about previously. And so the GHSA is basically the comparable federal collaborative association there, where you have representatives from each of those states. And so they basically help to outline high-level national safety plans, for example. And so these were the groups that were responsible for developing the MMUCC. And so the intent here was, if we go back decades, it's been a lot more standardized over the last 20 years, particularly. But the model criteria are basically the minimum data elements that are critical to safety forecasting and evaluation, and basically any type of traffic safety work. And so the first edition of these guidelines were developed back in the late 90s. We're currently at the 5th edition, I believe, is still the most current. And so this basically outlines 110 different data elements that agencies, so these aren't a federal mandate here. So this is guidance as opposed to, a standard necessarily, but most states are, very well aligned with these minimum criteria. And so 77 of those 110 are elements that are collected at the scene by the investigating officer. So these would be the fields on the UD10 crash report form, for example. And then beyond that, there are additional elements that are either derived based on the collected data. And so, for example, they'll collect information on a person's date of birth, and then from that, after the fact, they can derive age on that basis. They'll collect information generally about where that crash occurred on the roadway, and then after the fact, they can do some post determination as to whether, say, it's intersection or non-intersection related. There are a number of other derived fields based on those collected information. And then there's additional data that can be determined after the fact, assuming that we have the capability to integrate that crash data with either driver history, injury outcome data, and or roadway inventory data. Okay, so in the best case, all these different data systems would be integrated with one another, and the degree to which that happens kind of varies state to state, in part due to the resources available to that state, and then just how much has been invested historically in trying to introduce some of those different improvements. Now, with that being said, with these standards in place, there are a few different data quality measures that are used. And so there have been a few cases where projects have been funded. And as an example, when I was at Iowa State, we had projects where state data systems were basically evaluated based on different metrics so that those states could be given insights into where they could best use funds for improvements in the near term, basically. And one of the big ones there historically has been timeliness. So how quickly the data are available for purposes, either research or from the road agency standpoint. And with today's data, we can get that in almost real time at this point. There's a little bit of a delay when we try to get the year end. So the final crash database for a calendar year typically becomes available in April, May. And there's various reasons for that. There's some post-processing and data quality assurance, quality control checks that need to be done. But we've got access to some systems where we can get data in basically near real time as soon as it's entered. And if you compare that back to 20 or 30 years ago, at that point, the reports, rather than being electronic, were all paper-based. And so it took quite a bit more time in order to get that data processed and turned back around. And there are still some time lags if we look at some of the national databases like the Fatality Analysis Reporting System. 2019 data is currently available. I think 2020 will probably become available around summertime traditionally. But even in that case, that's become available a lot more quickly due to some of the advances in electronic reporting and the automation of some of these processes. Accuracy is really important, and there's several different ways we can think about accuracy. Can you guys think of where there may be potential inaccuracies in terms of crash data? There are a range of different issues, and we'll get into some of these in a little bit here, but just off the top of your head, any thoughts?
I guess maybe like location when it's not an intersection, like trying to figure out exactly where it happened.
Yeah, so location historically has been one of the most challenging, and that's just if you look at the nature in which those crashes are located on the UD10 form. So we'll have details of the roadway that the crash occurred on, and then we'll provide a reference point, which would either be a cross street in most cases, or in lieu of a cross street, we could refer to a mile marker or something of that nature. And so I hesitate to say it's easy, but it generally that information tends to be more reliable near intersections. But if you're along road segments where you might have, a mile or multiple miles between intersections, we tend to see patterns where crashes kind of quote unquote get clustered. So at like a quarter mile from an intersection or a half mile from an intersection, and so we lose a bit of fidelity there. Now, a lot of the more modern systems, officers have GPS built into their electronic reporting in the vehicle, so they can get that within a matter of feet in most cases these days, depending upon the reliability of those GPS systems. But yeah, location is definitely a big one. Any other common errors you think might come up in crash data?
I was going to say like something along the lines of like how the crash occurred, especially if there's only one driver that is fatality, or some drivers just reluctant to share how they created a accident, basically.
Yeah, that's a great point. Now that's one that's really challenging to address. So I wasn't even planning to go down that rabbit hole necessarily, but yeah, I mean that's due to the nature of crash reporting. Now, with that being said, um, officers do have pretty good training, and there's a fair amount of sophistication there in ways that they can at least try to determine, and specifically for the more severe crashes, like anytime there's a fatal, they'll have much more extensive investigation, looking at things like skid marks and some stuff they can measure in the field to at least try to corroborate the information that may be provided by witnesses or drivers. But in the case of fatal crashes, that becomes difficult. But just broadly trying to document the circumstances. So the fact that a lot of this might be self-reported, I guess, as you know, plays a role here. But even from the officer standpoint, if you think about how we would use this data as transportation engineers, we're interested in looking at crash patterns. And so there's a lot of confusion, or historically, there's been a fair amount of confusion about how those crashes should be coded. So if you look at, say, an angle collision versus a left turn head on collision, the orientation of the vehicles in those crashes tend to be quite similar, but the causal mechanisms or the contributing factors are significantly different. And so if those types of elements are miscoded, we can basically kind of misdiagnose what the nature of those problems are. And so we'll talk about a few of those issues as well subsequently. Completeness can be an issue. So as I had noted, there's 77 elements that are recommended for collection in the field. The officers, this is just one aspect among many that they're trying to work through on the crash site. And that would include, clearing the incident, getting traffic through safely while they're on the scene investigating. And then on top of that, they're filling out the crash report forms. And so there are certain fields that historically have been, more or less reliable, certain fields where there's incomplete information. And so as one example, for a long time, there is a work zone field on the crash report form. And sometimes it would indicate that there was a box that asked about whether work activity was ongoing, for example. And so some officers would say no work activity. And even though there wasn't a work zone in place whatsoever, so that's a box that was supposed to be filled out only if a preceding box said that, yes, there's a work zone here, and then whether there's activity in place or not. And so just trying to think, like, there's an annual publication that OHSP publishes on Michigan traffic crash facts, and a lot of other states do likewise. And they're basically just pulling summary data from those crash report forms. And so if you've got cases where data are either incomplete or entered inconsistently, that can potentially highlight some issues that aren't really issues, or it could mask some issues that are actually occurring there. So that becomes a bit of a problem. Again, that's one that's less of a concern these days, because with electronic systems, they're able to automate a lot of the quality control checks. And so if an officer enters information that's inconsistent across fields, as an example, that can be flagged as a part of that as a part of entering that data, and that removes kind of some of the after the fact quality control that needs to occur. Uniformity, so that's one of the big motivations for the MMUCC. And, I talked last time about how there's a lot of variability in terms of what crashes what crash data are collected. And the specific fields, it's also an area where there has been quite a bit of variability over time. There's been a lot more uniformity over the last 10 to 15 years, particularly there. And so the big advantage there is that makes it easier for us to make comparisons within and across different jurisdictions and agencies and so forth. And so all states are fairly good with that now. So if we wanted to compare across different municipalities or counties or regions, MPOs here in Michigan, it's more or less an apples to apples comparison now. That's probably not going to be the same if we're comparing a Michigan community to a community in another state, because some of those state standards may be slightly different. But we have seen some pretty good advances there. And that's quite important, because if you had, like, in a given state, if different MDOT regions were collecting different data, obviously that would have an influence on how, safety funds are invested, as an example. Data integration is a big one. And like I said, that's one where we've seen a lot of advances over the last 10 to 20 years. particularly on the roadway side. So there's a lot of states, including Michigan, where they'll do either annual or biennial surveys of their roadway. So they'll have either vehicles drive the roadways and collect video inventories, and they'll do pavement logs, and some states will collect LiDAR concurrently with that. And so we've got really rich roadway information typically, and that's getting better and better. And that can be linked back with the crash data. Driver records, like I said, Michigan is a more challenging state, so we don't have explicit systems that integrate all these elements together. The Secretary of State can and does integrate the crash records with their own data systems, but it's more challenging to get access to the Secretary of State information here versus comparable data in other states, in part because of privacy concerns and the way Michigan has historically handled that from a legislative perspective. So in contrast, Maryland has a very robust system where all of those different, so the driver records are directly integrated. I think motorcycle training and any of the general training information is pulled into that same data system. There was a project that was conducted back in the late 90s, early 2000s called CODES, which is Crash Outcome Data Evaluation Systems. And that focused on integrating EMS and hospital discharge records to crash records. So one thing we'll talk a little bit about, we measure crashes and the severity of injuries on basically a 5-point scale, KABCO, but you're relying on officers to make that judgment, and obviously they're not trained medical doctors. And so the intent of that project was to try to provide greater fidelity in terms of how severe the outcomes of some of those crashes were. And so I don't recall if Michigan had been involved in that at all, but there was basically some pilot work that was done to test out integration of some of these systems. And in some cases that they continue to use those. In other cases, there were problems. So like in the case of the CODES project, oftentimes there would be state laws that would limit our ability to share certain pieces of data like social security numbers or even names and addresses across systems due to privacy issues, right? So a hospital can't say that Pete Savalainen was involved in a traffic crash because that would put them into some liability concerns. But as an alternate to that, you can think about other measurable characteristics like age and gender and those types of things. So if you know somebody was involved in a crash and they were a 40-year-old male in this geographic area, you could probably match that with a reasonable level of confidence with hospital injury data, right? If somebody was involved in a car crash and they had those same characteristics, it's probably a pretty high probability that those are the same persons. And so it's something you probably haven't thought about, but in certain circumstances, there's certain data elements that can or can't be shared, and that makes it either more or less challenging to try to conduct some of these analyses. And I guess continuing on that point, the last issue here would just be the accessibility of that data. And I think I talked previously about how it was very hard for us to get the data when I was in Indiana, and it's been much easier here in Michigan, where basically it's all publicly available, at least in a sanitized format. There's certain stuff we can't get access to, but generally we're in pretty good shape there. So from a 50,000 foot perspective, these are a few of the different types of metrics we can use to evaluate the quality of our data systems. Okay. We already talked on a few of these. So if we look at the accuracy issues that tend to arise, location's a big one. So just locating where it occurred on the roadway. Direction can interestingly be a tricky one. So, generally speaking, you would think in a lot of cases, just whether the vehicle is traveling north, south, east, or west should be obvious. But, that's only the case if we're in a grid system, as an example. And if you think even about like interstates, and you're taking I-96 east, well, what happens if it jogs and you're going south or north or whatever the case may be? So there's a few instances. And again, these have been less of a concern with advances in some of the data systems. So it's less of a concern now because you can pull up a map and look at GIS and make sure that you've got it coded right in terms of the direction. But that can be a concern. And then I talked a little bit about the reference point precision. And so, an officer's probably not going to say, that this crash occurred 1,500 feet versus 1,200 feet from the nearest mile marker. They'll probably say a quarter mile, basically, right? And so that's where some of the advances in GPS have been really beneficial. From a crash type perspective, so I guess this is just a jump ball question to the two of you. So if either of you have a sense, when we code the crash type, I don't think we've talked about this yet. How should that be coded? Have we talked about this at all? So determining if a crash is an angle crash versus a left turn head on or a side swipe. So if it occurs at an intersection, would we be interested in the orientation at which those vehicles collided? Would that be the basis for that decision? Or I'm trying to lead you a little bit there,
I
to be
think
honest.
yes.
It sounds important.
Yeah, so kind of, sort of. So a lot of times we'll see cases where we've got miscoding, because if you think about this from like a diagnostic perspective, we're interested in crash type primarily because we want to know why that crash occurred, what the drivers were trying to do. And then on that basis, we can determine, well, is there something problematic about that roadway location that's contributed to the type of error that would lead to that scenario occurring? And so at an intersection, for example, if you've got an angle crash, I mean, that's generally only going to occur when somebody's, violating whatever the traffic control is. They're running a red light, or at a stop controlled location, they haven't had a sufficient gap in traffic, or whatever the case may be. Occasionally, as those events are occurring, instead of it being an angle collision, one driver may notice the other vehicle approaching, and so they may swerve and they actually collide as like a sideswipe type collision. But we want to be careful not to code that as a sideswipe, because you would anticipate, if that crash were occurring at an intersection, you'd have two vehicles that are going either in the same direction or opposite directions, and it's not the same as an angle collision in context, right? And so that's a type of thing. I think they do a good job of officer training, and that is less of an issue, but we'll have some slides subsequently where it does occasionally happen. So I think when someone's first on the job, they just might not really realize what the background is for the reason we're coding that as we are. And so when those issues arise, you can potentially, just misdiagnose the reason those crashes are occurring. And as a consequence, you might miss some important aspect of what's happening at a given location. Errors in location. So this used to be a fun issue to work around. We would try to match crashes or identify crashes at locations, just giving information about the street names as an example. And so you'd see all sorts of different issues. So I don't know if either of you are familiar with Woodward Avenue in Detroit. It's also referred to as M1. And you would see all sorts of different spellings of Woodward. You would see sometimes they would use M-1, M space 1. And so if you're trying to use information in a database to match that, it becomes really problematic. Now, fortunately, all these intersections, we basically have a geographic system that we assign a unique code to each of those intersections is how it works now. And so they have some logic to account for basically spelling errors. And there's even in like Excel tools, you can do matches, near matches for parts of the word, for an example. So that becomes less of a concern these days. At intersections, so I mentioned that crashes tend to be more accurately located there. But as per the crash report manual, so those offset distances should be measured from the center of the intersection, whereas in some cases an officer might measure it from the near side curb, for example, there, and that could give you a markedly different answer in terms of where that crash is occurring. And then, as I had noted, crash type becomes an issue. So we're really interested in what the intended directions of those vehicles are, more so than what actually occurred as a result of the crash. So what the driver was trying to do versus anything evasive action they took that would have varied from what they were intending to do. And that just, again, gets back to trying to determine the causative factors associated with those crashes. And so here's just these next few slides have a few different examples here. So in this case, we have an angle crash. A vehicle was initially going northbound. Their final direction was eastbound. The other vehicle was going southbound. Its final direction was also eastbound here. Now on the crash report form, they just have the one vehicle direction field. And so this just diagnoses a potential solution to that issue. So in this case, both the vehicles are intended to be traveling east, and so it's coded as an angle, and so it doesn't really make sense how you would get an angle collision among two vehicles that were going east. And so now, in this case, we basically notice that this should have been coded basically as a sideswipe same collision, which is entirely different than an angle to the preceding point we had talked about there. And so that's one example. The next few slides go through some similar examples. So here's another crash that's coded as an angle. And so this was basically a left turn head on instead. So this is a case where this vehicle number 2 was probably waiting for a gap in traffic and misjudged that gap. And as a consequence, they cut in front of vehicle 1. Whereas in case of an angle collision, that would have been appropriate if vehicle 2 was coming from this completely different perpendicular approach here. So when these types of issues arise, these tend to become fairly big problems here ultimately. A few other examples here. So here's another case. This one's coded as an angle, and this is another one here where it basically should have been a same direction side swipe. So anytime you've got collisions like this, where both vehicles are ultimately trying to occupy that same space ultimately, so those would typically be sideswipe same collisions. And so oftentimes those are some of the ones that become the most problematic. I think I might have a few other examples here of crashes that occur. So near driveways are a bit of a problem as well, because oftentimes those are kind of tricky because a lot of times those vehicles aren't making through movements. They'd be turning left or right. And so you'd see a lot of patterns near intersections that might be somewhat confusing or counterintuitive when you're trying to look at those. And so we can keep going through a number of different examples here, but there's a myriad of these types of issues. So here's just a case where it seems pretty obvious this is a side swipe same, but it looks like this was just a coding mistake by the officers that was coded as side swipe opposite for some reason. Pedestrian crash here coded as an angle. So there's actually separate crash fields for pedestrian or bicycle involved crashes. And so you run into those types of things occasionally. That's less of a concern now, though, like I said, with some of the automated data systems. Another example of a left turn head on coded as an angle. And so in all these cases, you'll notice this is back when we had the paper forms. And so I mentioned this previously. The data tended to be a lot richer in these as compared to what we'd see currently. So I'd say with present technology, these diagrams have got better because the tools for drawing these have been automated or made electronic in nature. But we haven't seen quite the same level of good detail, I would say, with the narratives as a consequence of that. And so it's been a bit of a trade-off to a degree. Additional cases here. So occasionally they'll code a crash type as other. Now, typically we would reserve that for cases where the maneuvers are unknown or just very unusual in nature. And that's something that there's not really a good audit process built in currently to try to check those types of issues. But and so here's just kind of an example that demonstrates one example. So let's assume we've got a crash that's occurring at First in Main, and we're given that one vehicle is headed southbound, one's headed eastbound, and we're given that the crash has occurred 30 feet south of Main Street. And so with those 5 pieces of information from the crash report form, there are a few different ways we could code that. So if it's coded correctly as it should be, and we're estimating that at 30 feet south of the center line of that roadway, the center of the intersection, that crash would be located about here roughly. Whereas if instead we coded that from the curb line, that would have looked like a crash that's attributable to that driveway. And so that gets to kind of the importance of both the the geographic information and then the crash type information here, because obviously you'd have different solutions if you saw a pattern of these types of crashes versus these types of crashes. And so obviously we'd have different countermeasures for each of those cases. You'd probably have some type of access control potentially here, whereas in this case, it may be a signal timing clearance interval type issue. And so consequently, that information is largely lost to us in the database. And so if that information is not coded correctly, that becomes somewhat problematic for us from a big picture perspective. And then, like I said, a few of the other ones that occur pretty frequently, just officer errors, I guess. And so that angle collision, again, is just basically based on those intended paths. So both vehicles are trying to go straight in perpendicular directions at a given roadway location. But sometimes you just see cases where the vehicles collided at an angle. So an officer would just classify it as an angle on that basis. And so while they did in fact collide at an angle, that's kind of distorting how the policy for how those should be coded, essentially. Okay. And then again, another example of the angle versus left turn head on, which is the most frequently cited example I'll use in these cases. And another example here, just the left turn head on versus a head on crash. So, you know, it's might be somewhat difficult to distinguish among them. You'd have to know that this vehicle was aiming to turn left. And so that would be a difficult determination. Say if this occupant was fatally injured, obviously we wouldn't be able to make that determination there. But if we were able to interview that driver and determine what their intended action is, that's really the only way we'd be able to make the correct determination in that case. Okay. And so this is actually results from a study that had been done back when Dr. Gates and I were at Wayne State, so mid 2000s. That just looked at the information that's provided from the crash report fields on the UD10 form, and that was compared to basically the information from the diagram and the narratives. And so you'll notice here some pretty significant discrepancies across some of these different crash types, particularly those left turn head-ons and the angles were the ones that historically have had the biggest problem with coding issues. And then there's a lot of single vehicle crashes where they just get thrown into the other category for various reasons. So deer involved crashes, collisions with parked vehicles, things of that nature, for example. So in net, 12.3%, which is a fairly high percentage, but across some of these categories, those misclassification rates were even greater. And so this, I haven't seen more recent data here. I'd be kind of interested to see what a follow-up study would look like. So again, this is 15 years later or so. But I would assume it's still an issue, but I would presume to a lesser degree with some of those quality control checks we have built in. And so in terms of error mitigation strategies, electronic crash reports have done away with a lot of these issues. There had been some discussion about modifying, so rather than just having the initial direction of the vehicle, and then it's intended, we could also include the final direction or intended direction of the vehicle there. That hasn't happened yet. And so that's, I guess, an area that might warrant a bit further investigation. And then officer training becomes a big issue here as well. And so anytime there's updates to the crash report form, I think the most recent update occurred in 2016. There's a bit of a rollout process there. And so I don't know if any of you have been working with crash data at all, but if you're trying to compare crash data prior to 2016, there was kind of a slow integration period where the new form was used inconsistently or not by all agencies in 2016. And then by 2017, I think virtually all the agencies were using the crash report form. But if you try to look at some of the fields that were changed there, and driver distraction would be one example there, there are also those types of issues that come into play as well. So anyway, there's a whole host of issues related to crash data. In addition to that, there's the other important element here would be the roadway and traffic data we had alluded to previously. And so there aren't any regulations or minimum standards per se here, but there has been guidance that's been developed to that end. The FHWA in the FAST Act had introduced the model inventory of roadway elements. And so this is basically the first point at which there had actually been a requirement as per road agencies to provide this information. And so this was for basically all of the federal aid system. So anything that would be getting federal funds for those improvements, so anything beyond rural minor collector and local roads. There's a fairly exhaustive list of data elements here, so more than 200. The requirements aren't as rigorous for low volume roads. So if you look at like the AASHTO definition for low volume roads, if we've got less than 400 vehicles per day, there's not the same level of requirements there, in part because traffic's so low that it's just less of a concern in those cases. We're focusing these efforts towards the higher class roads. Unpaved and gravel roads can be excluded from this requirement, provided that there aren't any dedicated safety funds being allocated towards those roadways. And so among those 200 plus elements, there are 37 that have been identified as fundamental. So these are basically sort of the absolute minimum elements for data-driven safety programs. And those elements vary across 3 different facility types. So they've got a separate set of data elements for road segments versus intersections versus interchanges and ramps ultimately. Okay. And so map 21, so this was just back in 2012. Well, just back, I guess it's almost 10 years now at this point. But so this is when this guidance was first introduced. And so this was basically the result of a series of working groups of the FHWA in coordination with various state DOTs. Historically, a lot of this data has been collected through the HPMS. Are you familiar at all with the Highway Performance Monitoring System? So every year, you're probably aware states are required to provide estimates of traffic volumes, as an example, of general roadway condition information. And so that's basically all collected and reported through the HPMS, which is an MDOT maintained database. And so that provided a lot of the same minimum data elements, but there were certain gaps in that system. And so this basically built upon the HPMS. And so further information can be provided here, but again, largely the purpose of the HPMS is focusing on use and operating characteristics, so volumes, speeds at select locations, roadway condition, etc. And for some of those elements, they collect data for the entire system. In other cases, they would collect a sample of data and then it would extrapolate that across the system, depending upon the specific data element that we're talking about. And then for the minimum, the model inventory of roadway elements, the goal here ultimately was to capture all public roads. So historically, as you can probably guess, which types of roadways would we have the best data for, or the most comprehensive data, I guess is the way I should phrase that.
Freeways, highways, I guess.
Yeah, so freeways would be one example. And if I was thinking just in terms of maybe which agencies would have the most robust or comprehensive data?
Probably MDOT.
Right. So predominantly it's the DOTs that would have the best and most robust data, in part because they would have, the most funding. Those roads are also where most of the travel is occurring. But keeping in mind then that those comprise a relatively small part of the overall system. And so our goal would be to ultimately monitor all of those roads and collect data for all of those roads. And so that was one of the impetuses here. With that being said, data collection was prioritized there as noted in the preceding slide. So federal aid roads versus non-federal aid. So federal aid, that's where all of those funds are going ultimately. And so that's why there was a specific impetus to capture information on those higher class roads. Likewise, state maintained versus non-state maintained. And again, a lot of that was triggered by funding mechanisms by and large in terms of where those funds would go for roadway improvements. Functional class, likewise. So to Travis's point, freeways, better data in part because we have more traffic. So the higher class those roads are, the more important it would be to collect these different data elements. And so arterials would generally have better data than collectors and locals and so forth. Urban versus rural, there's several different distinctions there, but also the types of data and the general natures of those roadways tend to vary across those areas. And so we'd have different expectations for what data would be collected in each location. And then if we've got locations with higher crashes, that would also tend to be an emphasis area. We'd have more and better data for some of those higher risk locations as well. And so this is just kind of giving a snapshot of where we have the most mileage versus where we would have the best data, for example, there. And so we have really good data for the MDOT maintained roads, and it's not quite that same level in these other instances. And so that makes it a bit more challenging for some of these county and local agencies to try to make some of their decisions as compared to MDOT. And so that's oftentimes MDOT develops systems, and those become aspirational systems for the county and local agencies, depending upon
the availability of funding. I think my headphones have just died. Can you guys hear me? Okay. And so that becomes an impetus then. I think I talked previously about the RoadSoft program that was developed by Michigan Tech. So a lot of agencies are using that RoadSoft as a part of their roadway inventory. Okay. There was basically a requirement in map 21 that all crashes are locatable. And so for that to be the case, all of those roads would need to be part of a linear referencing system. And so up until that point, there was quite a bit of inconsistency from state to state in terms of how accurately crashes could be located. And so basically any crash occurring on a public road now needs to be locatable as per map 21. And so to that end, a lot of states, you've probably seen a lot of these open GIS portals that have been introduced by MDOT and some other agencies recently. And so that's made it a lot easier to try to integrate some of this other information, because in order to have a good, comprehensive inventory system, we really need that fundamental underlying GIS roadway file that we can use to integrate those other data elements ultimately. Okay. And so as we step through this, the next few slides are basically going to document what those minimum, functional data elements are as per Meyer for the different facility types. And so starting with road segments, the most important information, just fundamental stuff. So segment identifier, we need to know the name of the roadway, its number, as the case may be, a step below that, but we need some kind of unique identifier that's assigned to each segment. Whether it's rural versus urban in nature, whether it's asphalt or concrete or some combination thereof, we would need locational information. So mile points, the begin and end point of those segments, the functional class of the roadway, number of lanes, AADT, and then who has jurisdiction. Okay. There are a number of other elements. So everything on this list would be required for the bulk of the roads. The ones that are highlighted in blue here are specific just to those lower volume roads. So for the higher volume roads, we collect some additional information, including segment length, whether a median is present, and if so, what type of median, the level of access control. So in the case of a segment, full access control for interstates and freeways, and then we'd have various levels of limited access control, whether it's one-way or two-way in nature. So just think about these. These are different types of information that would be informative for us in trying to just assess safety and which factors might contribute to some of the safety performance that we're observing on a given location. In contrast, at intersections, the list isn't nearly as comprehensive in this case. So basically just general information about where those intersections are located. Geometric and traffic control information, so whether it's signalized or stop controlled, yield controlled, whatever the case may be. In terms of the geometry, so whether it's 3-leg, 4-leg, some other type of orientation, traffic volumes, approach identifiers. So this is one, when I was at Iowa State, we had a very comprehensive project where they developed a shapefile of literally every intersection in the state. And that's an exhaustive effort. If you think about a state like Iowa that has a lot of these rural gravel roads, and you're going through and trying to code all of those. And so we had, I can't even imagine how many thousands of student and staff hours going through and developing that database. And so not just every intersection, but every approach to those intersections. And this is historically a bit of a problem or a gap here in Michigan, in that we have some really good roadway files, but we don't have a great master intersection file like we had in Iowa. And so, for example, when we're doing safety analyses, if we're looking at intersections at 2 MDOT roads, we're generally in really good shape there, because we'd have from the historical sufficiency file or from some of the more modern files, we can in a fairly straightforward manner integrate those. But if it's an MDOT road with a county road or a local road, then some of that information for the lower class road just simply might not be available to us, for example. Even if it is, it can be a real challenge to integrate the approach specific information. So let's say, you may have auxiliary turn lanes on one approach, but not the other. And so as we think about how we would code that, ideally you'd like just one kind of master intersection database that would have all that information. But just given the complexity, oftentimes, in Iowa, we had the intersection database that provided the general information about each of those intersections. And then there'd be information specific to the approach that we would also collect. But it became quite a challenge trying to effectively analyze and work from those databases. So that's kind of like the gold standard, basically, and something we're working towards. But these are basically just kind of the minimum elements here. And so in this case, just identifiers for each of the individual approaches so that we can locate crashes at an intersection to whatever approach it occurred on, for example, is what we're looking at there. Interchanges are significantly more complex. So we've got some work we're doing right now to try to assess safety performance at interchanges. And so you'll notice none of these are blue because there aren't any interchanges that are serving less than 400 vehicles per day, because obviously it'd be a bit of an overbuild in that case. But the minimum information here, just information that, again, locates and identifies that interchange. The lengths of ramps, we've got an NCHRP study right now where we're trying to assess the XL decel lane performance and also the safety performance of the ramps themselves. And so there's certain elements that are important to us there. The type of interchange. And so there's a wide range of different interchange configurations. And we've seen some of the more modern intersections. Well, I guess I don't know that a single point urban interchange is all that modern anymore, but a diverging diamond, some of these interchanges that have become more prevalent in the last 20 years or so. So if you think about trying to take a roadway database that used to be pretty straightforward, if we just had, basically diamond and loop ramps, for example. But as you introduce these more sophisticated designs, it becomes a bit more challenging trying to develop a database that effectively captures, some of those nuances. Okay. Traffic volume, again, functional class. So the same general types of elements that we would see for the intersections or road segments. And so those are the minimums. Beyond this, like I said, there's another, 160 odd additional data elements that aren't at this minimum fundamental data, but that supplement that. A few other just quick points of nuance I wanted to get into as we wrap up here. So sorry, we're hitting 10:30 right now. But one challenging issue is just defining intersections for the purposes of safety evaluation, because typically what we find is that the causative factors that crashes at intersections are significantly different than what we see at segments, right? And one of the concerns there is, well, how large do you make those intersection boundaries so that we're effectively capturing all of the crashes that are due in some form or fashion to the intersection itself? And so to that end, in an urban setting, those definitions are going to be a bit different than in a rural setting. In any sense why that might be the case, why we'd have different radii in urban versus rural areas?
Different traveling speeds.
Say that again, Travis.
Different traveling speeds. So in urban,
So different travel speeds would definitely be one of the issues there. In addition to that, when we're in, hold on, I think I might be having some issues here with my audio. Okay. In addition to travel speeds, as we get into urban areas, so by default, a lot of times we'll use either 150 or 200 or 250 feet for radii. As you get into dense urban areas, what's the problem that comes up with those larger radii?
It's expensive to build a large intersection in an urban area.
Yeah, so what will tend to happen is we'll start double counting those intersections that are in close proximity to one another. A completely tangential issue to this that's arisen for an ongoing project we have with Ford is if you've got two divided roadways intersecting with one another, in Michigan's data systems, in the roadway inventory file, that shows up as 4 distinct nodes or points. So while that's really just one intersection, it looks as though it's 4 from a data perspective. And so those are among the more complex and safety challenging types of intersections. And so there are concerns that arise there. And so if we look at, these are the radii that we would use from the work we did at Iowa State. So in urban areas, we'd make that as little as 75 feet, because again, to Travis's point, they tended to be lower speed and also more densely spaced. Rural settings, 150 up to 250. Again, depending on the speeds, we tend to broaden that out, because on higher speed facilities, the effects can spill back a significantly larger difference. And then expressway intersections, which we don't have as many of these here in Michigan. Like US 127 is about the only expressway I can think of where you'd have at grade intersections along a 65 or 70 mile per hour roadway. And so in that case, we'd go with a larger 300-foot radius, for example. Okay. So, but not a trivial determination there. Likewise, defining a road segment. So when we set up these road segments in our databases, we'd like to structure those so that the segments are generally homogeneous. And so if we look at this map right here, we have a road that looks to be fairly homogeneous, and then all of a sudden, whoa, it splits off into a couple of one-way streets in this case. And so obviously we'd want to structure our database so that this looks like a fairly homogeneous segment, and then we'd break this off, and you'll notice we've got some weird stuff happening here. And so typically, if we think about when we'd break segments, you don't want to make them too small, because if you change them anytime any of your characteristics change, it becomes impractical, because they might be too small for you to even collect enough crashes on those segments. And so we'll have various minimum recommendations. The Highway Safety Manual, I'm trying to remember off the top of my head, I want to say 0.1 miles is the minimum recommendation as per the HSM. Generally speaking, I think half mile or more would be a preferred length for various reasons. Jordan, you got a question?
Yeah, I have a quick question. So I don't know if I just completely missed this, but when you're talking about defining an intersection, is that the radius like you go out to characterize a crash is at that intersection, or are we talking about something different there?
Yeah, so when I talked on the preceding slide, defining an intersection was just how large that radius should be. So if we're, a lot of times we'll prioritize intersections for safety improvements. And so the radius you use there is going to be critical, because if you make it too small and you're not capturing all the crashes that are due to it, that hurts us from a network screening standpoint. But then secondly, the other issue that comes into play there, we typically pull those intersection crashes out when we do our segment level analyses. And so there's kind of a carryover effect there, where if crashes that are attributable to the intersection are instead appended to the segment, then you're potentially missing on your over ranking those segments in as a consequence there. So good question. Yeah, that's what I was talking about in that context. Did I answer your other question as well there? Or...
Yeah, no, that was my question. Yeah, thanks.
Okay. So yeah, that's just the general point. So in any of these instances, we'd like to set up our databases so that all the locations are homogeneous to the extent possible. We'd like for them to be similar in length. Otherwise, it becomes somewhat challenging. You know, how do you compare a half-mile segment to a 5-mile segment? And there, we'll talk a little bit about some of the aggregation strategies in some of the subsequent lectures here. And so here in Michigan, we have what's referred to as the Michigan Geographic Framework. And so this provides very general information for the entire federal aid network. So for every roadway you see here in purple, we have AADT and we have surface type information. For the MDOT maintained network, in addition to that, we also have details of number of lanes, shoulders, medians, widths of each of those elements, where there's horizontal curves and driveways. And so just this list right here is a fairly good cross section. We don't have that same level though, unfortunately, on the county roads. And if you step it down further where all these white gaps are, these would be local roads, basically. It's really hit or miss depending upon, the agency. Larger cities generally would have better databases than some of the smaller cities, and so forth. Intersections. So this is just a map of where MDOT's rural signalized intersections are located. Surprisingly, it takes a bit of effort to try to get to, I don't know, there's got to be a comprehensive database of MDOT signals, but I'm not aware of a comprehensive inventory of all signals in the state, for example. And so on the MDOT system, there's 195 of these rural signalized. So we've done some dedicated analyses specific to those. This is a map of all the MDOT rural stop controlled intersections. So again, MDOT has really good data here, and then counties and locals, it's a bit more hit and miss depending upon what programs and platforms they're using for those analyses. And so MDOT/MDOT. So where both of the roads are MDOT, there's 153 of those, but there's a significantly larger, more than 10 times that number of MDOT intersections with county roads on the federal aid system. And so that's, challenging. If you look at the rural intersection project that Dr. Gates led a few years ago, I think that probably predated when you guys got on board here. But we had really good data for this subset of 153, but we collected some sample data, and you've probably seen Steve Stapleton or Anthony Engel report on some of the work we did on those studies, where we sampled from this remaining 1755 in select counties, for example. And I guess as I wrap up the last couple points here, hopefully I haven't put you guys over time for a subsequent meeting here, but one thing that's really challenging, so I talked about how we want our segments to largely be homogeneous. Unfortunately, what tends to happen is you'll have different characteristics that change at different points on the road network. And so if you look at when any of these different characteristics change, you're going to end up chopping that road network into very small pieces, and that just makes it impractical in some cases. And so the way the segments are broke in the geographic framework are basically anytime there's an intersection or a bridge, anytime the surface type changes, or anytime there's a critical change in the cross section. So when there's a change in the number of travel lanes, when shoulder widths change, or when medians are introduced, or when those segments would tend to break. And so that makes sense. Now, with that being said, there are other factors that are also important, like traffic volume. So when volume changes, that tends to be important. There are ways, we can compute weighted averages based on segment lengths and things of that nature. But historically, oh, and sorry, I need to update this. So historically, the sufficiency file has been the official roadway inventory, and that basically had been phased out in 2017. And so now we're operating from Meyer, and there have been some differences. Some data's gotten better, some data's gotten worse. And so that's something we're kind of continuing to work through. So we're still using the older sufficiency data for a lot of our analyses, just because some of these newer data systems, they have the potential for more capabilities, but we're still kind of building out some of those systems, and they haven't been as well integrated as some of the historical files from sufficiency, as an example. Okay. And so this is just a snapshot of some of the different data systems that we have access to or have even helped to build here in-house. We'll start talking about a little bit more of these specific data sets as we move forward in some of the more analytical work later in the semester. And then I've already talked a little bit about the data integration piece. So we'll also talk about how we integrate these data. And in the Michigan case, we're really only focusing with these three elements because we don't have that explicit integration with the injury and patient outcome data here. So I think that wraps up where I was. Oh, sorry. So I ended up pulling the roadway inventory stuff into today. So we'll start talking about traffic volume and condition diagrams and some of the other data next week. The second assignment is due a week from Friday. And that's basically summarized here. I've also posted that in D2L, so you can find it directly there. And I'll provide further details next week because I went a bit over time here. But for the project, what I'm looking to do, I've got some exercises where I'll have you work through the fatality analysis reporting system and familiarize yourself with that. I don't have those types of exercises for two of the newer data systems that NHTSA has introduced over the past 3 to 4 years. And so I'm going to look for assistance from you guys in working with the crash investigation sampling system and the crash report sampling system. We'll talk a little bit more about those moving forward, but that is basically what I have for today. So any questions from you guys?